Ever wish you could tailor your kids' education? Picking exactly what and how they learn.
It's a dream for a lot of parents.
It is, but then comes the reality check. How do you pay for it?
It's fascinating how much variation there is.
Mhm.
Some homeschooling families are entirely self-funded, which in many states means more freedom, but obviously less financial support. But then there are state-funded programs like education savings accounts or ESAs that offer a different path.
Our sources show this can be a really controversial area.
You see, some in the homeschool community are concerned about what they call education liberty, the idea that parents should have the ultimate say in their child's education. They worry that accepting government funds could open the door to more state control and regulations.
So they'd rather have the autonomy, even if it means paying out of pocket.
Right. For example, the Nevada Homeschool Network.
Yeah.
A group advocating for homeschoolers in Nevada actually fought to keep homeschooling families out of the state's ESA program.
Really?
They believe that accepting public funds could ultimately erode the freedom and flexibility that homeschooling offers.
So even within the homeschooling community, there's debate about this. It's not as simple as homeschoolers want funding.
It gets even more complex when you consider how ESAs are implemented across different states.
Okay.
Some have very robust programs, while others offer limited options.
Okay, so let's zoom out from Nevada and look at the bigger picture across the U.S.
Sure. This article from Scholars and Socials does a good job of outlining the different approaches. You've got ESAs, which we've talked about, but also tax credits, deductions, grants. It's a patchwork with no two states exactly alike.
So families really need to do their homework. What strings might be attached, right?
And that's where understanding the different arguments surrounding public funding becomes really important.
Okay.
Proponents, for example, often highlight the idea of parental choice,
arguing
that all families should have the freedom to choose the educational path that best suits their children's needs, regardless of their financial situation.
Yeah.
They also emphasize the potential for increased accountability, arguing that if public funds are being used, there should be mechanisms in place to ensure they're being used effectively.
But what about the other side? Our sources mention some pretty strong arguments against using public funds for homeschooling too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Concerns about fiscal responsibility are a big one. Opponents of public funding argue that diverting tax dollars away from traditional public schools could weaken them further, particularly in states where those schools are already struggling.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a concern, especially for families who rely on those public schools.
And then there's the issue of potential abuse. Some argue that with less oversight, there's a higher risk of funds being misused or misallocated, which ultimately harms the students.
So we've got these philosophical debates about the role of government in education mixed with practical concerns about how money is actually spent. And then you throw in legal challenges like what's happening in South Carolina.
Right. In South Carolina, there's a legal battle brewing over the Education Scholarship Trust Fund.
Right.
It's a program meant to help families afford private school tuition, but it's been challenged on the grounds that it violates the state constitution's Blaine Amendment.
Wait, the Blaine Amendment? What's that?
It's basically a clause found in many state constitutions, including South Carolina's, that's often interpreted to prohibit the use of public funds for religious schools. So this legal challenge boils down to the question of whether using vouchers for private school tuition, which can include religious schools, is constitutional or not.
So it's not just about policy preferences. We're talking about deep-seated legal and constitutional questions that are intertwined with these funding debates.
And those legal battles can have real-world consequences for families. Our sources highlight the story of a mom in South Carolina whose kids saw a huge improvement after switching to private school using vouchers. But when the funding was deemed unconstitutional, she suddenly faced the difficult choice of either pulling her kids out of the school that was working for them or figuring out how to pay the tuition herself.
Why, that's heartbreaking.
It is.
Her story really brings home the human cost of these complex legal and policy debates.
And it highlights the importance of staying informed and understanding the arguments from all sides, because ultimately the decisions made at the state and national levels about homeschool funding have a very real and personal impact on families like hers.
And speaking of different perspectives, our sources also took us to South Dakota, where we see another layer of this debate play out.
Right. There, public school advocates are raising concerns about voucher programs diverting much-needed funds from public schools, especially in a state where those schools are already facing financial strain.
That's a valid concern, especially for families who depend on those public schools for their children's education.
They argue that these programs could actually worsen existing inequalities, potentially leading to a two-tiered education system where families with more resources have more options, while those with less are left behind.
But I imagine proponents have counterarguments to that, right? They wouldn't just stand by and watch public schools crumble, would they?
Of course not. They argue that voucher programs actually increase educational access and options for everyone. By giving parents more choices, voucher programs can spur competition and innovation, ultimately benefiting both public and private schools.
So they're saying a rising tide lifts all boats.
In a nutshell, yes. And they point to the potential relief that voucher programs could provide for overcrowded public schools, especially in areas experiencing rapid growth.
Okay, so even in a single state, you've got these competing viewpoints and concerns about fairness, access, and the impact on different types of schools.
Exactly. And this takes us to a really crucial point about the homeschool funding landscape. It's not a black and white issue. There are no easy answers. It's so important to understand the arguments from all sides.
So before we dive into more specifics, let's take a step back. You've mentioned ESAs, tax credits, deductions, grants. It seems like there's a whole alphabet soup of funding options out there. Could you break those down for us? What are the key differences between these programs and what should families be looking for?
Let's start with ESAs, since those seem to be generating the most buzz and controversy.
Sounds good. I think a lot of our listeners are probably wondering, what exactly is an ESA and how does it work?
Okay, imagine this. You're a family choosing to homeschool, and the state deposits a certain amount of money into an account specifically for your child's education. You then have the flexibility to use that money for a variety of approved expenses, like curriculum, tutoring, online courses, even therapy or educational therapies if your child has special needs.
So it's like having a personalized education budget for your child.
It allows them to customize their child's education in a way that simply wouldn't be possible within the traditional public school system.
But like we discussed earlier, that flexibility can also lead to questions about oversight and accountability.
Some states have very strict guidelines about what those funds can be used for, while others offer more flexibility.
What about those other options you mentioned? Tax credits and deductions. How do those work?
Well, tax credits and deductions offer a different approach. Instead of receiving direct funding, families can claim certain educational expenses on their taxes, reducing their overall tax burden.
It's more like a reimbursement system.
And it's often seen as a less controversial way to support educational choice because it doesn't involve directly allocating public funds to private schools or homeschooling families.
Okay, so families are essentially getting a break on their taxes for choosing to educate their children outside of the public school system. So we've got ESAs, which are like these personalized education accounts, and tax credits deductions, which are more like reimbursements. What about grants? Are those a common way to fund homeschooling?
Grants are definitely out there, but they tend to be less common and more competitive. These are typically offered by private foundations, nonprofit organizations, or even religious groups. And they often have specific criteria that families must meet to qualify.
So it's like applying for a scholarship, but for homeschooling expenses.
And just like scholarships, the availability and amount of grant funding can vary widely.
Okay.
Some grants might cover the full cost of a specific program or curriculum, while others might offer a partial scholarship to offset some of the expenses. And it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The best approach will depend on your family's unique circumstances, your state's laws and regulations, and your own educational philosophy.
This is all so incredibly helpful. But I have to ask, how do families even begin to sort through all this? It seems overwhelming.
It definitely can be, especially when you're first starting out. That's why connecting with other homeschooling families in your area can be so valuable.
Yeah.
They can share their experiences, offer tips, and point you in the right direction.
Right. It's like having a mentor for the homeschool funding journey. But where can families find those connections?
Local homeschooling groups, online forums, and even social media can be great resources. And many states have homeschooling associations that provide support, information, and advocacy for homeschooling families.
So networking and building community is key, not just for the educational aspects of homeschooling, but for the financial side as well.
Homeschooling is often seen as this very independent and self-reliant endeavor, but there's a lot to be said for connecting with others who are navigating the same challenges and celebrating the same successes.
That's a great point. And speaking of challenges, let's go back to the issue of government oversight and education liberty. How do we ensure that funding programs support educational choice without stifling innovation or infringing on parental rights?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It seems like there are strong arguments on both sides.
There are, and different states are experimenting with different approaches. Some are opting for more hands-off models, trusting parents to make the best decisions for their children, while others are implementing stricter regulations and accountability measures to ensure that public funds are being used appropriately.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's a conversation worth having. And hopefully, by understanding the nuances of this debate, we can all work together to create a system that supports both educational choice and accountability.
And it's important to remember that behind these policy debates are real families trying to make the best decisions for their children.
And their voices deserve to be heard. Let's explore the arguments, examine the evidence, and try to understand the real-world impact of different approaches to homeschool funding, because ultimately it's about creating a system that empowers families.
There's a whole community of homeschooling families out there facing similar challenges, celebrating similar victories. Tap into that support network.
Yeah, remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about the different approaches to funding, the better equipped you'll be to make the best choices for your family's unique journey. So keep those conversations going, connect with other homeschooling families, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the world of alternative education.